Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support this channel, its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. Today I'm having to do double duty because I'm doing the Deconverters Bible study, When God Kills. But this story also fits under heroes of faith, as Jephthah is also listed as a hero of faith, as well in Hebrews 11. So we're looking at two things today as far as this story. We're looking at another story where God is responsible ultimately for the death of a person, and we are asking the question of why the writer of Hebrews would include this person as one of his heroes of faith that he wants his readers to look to as far as building their faith. That is why Jephthah in the Bible study of Heroes of Faith will probably appear out of order for those of you following along in that series. The story of Jephthah and his daughter appears in Judges 11. I'm going to summarize it here, but you're welcome to stop the video and read it in your favorite version before continuing. The story starts out by pointing out that Jephthah is a valiant warrior whose father was Gilead. However, his mother was a prostitute. Gilead has other sons by his legitimate wife, and when they all get older, these sons drive Jephthah out and refuse to give him part of the inheritance of their father because he is the son of a prostitute. Jephthah makes do by becoming the leader of men, but those men are considered outcasts like himself and called worthless by the text. Times change and the Amorites become a problem. So the sons of Gilead come to Jephthah and ask him to lead their fight against the Ammonites. They actually offer him the headship of Gilead people in exchange for him leading them. First, Jephthah seems to refuse, as he is an outcast by these very people, but after he gets assurance he will be the next judge of God, as people give their oaths on that before God, he accepts the role. From verses 12 through 28 of Judges chapter 11, we get a dialogue between the Amorites and Jephthah as to why there's even a dispute. And it comes down to the fact the Israelites have taken land that once belonged to the Amorites and they want it back. If this sounds familiar, this land dispute seems to continue right to the present day. But Jephthah is basically saying that the Amorites didn't deal fairly with the children of Israel back in the day, so Yahweh gave it to them. So battle lines are drawn once again in fight of possession of the land. Yahweh and his people on one side, and the Amorites and their god Chemosh on the other. This is where the tale takes both a good and tragic turn for Jephthah. On the way to the battle, he makes a vow that if Yahweh grants him victory, that he will sacrifice as a burnt offering the first thing that comes out to him and greets him when he returns home. The battle takes place, and Jephthah is indeed victorious and takes 20 cities for Israel and beats the Amorites to the point that they were submitted to what Israel wanted after that. Yahweh beats Chemosh again, and all is right in the Israelite world. The tale, however, begins to take a tragic turn when Jephthah comes home, and the first thing that comes out to greet him is his daughter, his only child. She is understandably happy for her father and praises his victory, very much in the same way that Miriam did when Pharaoh and his armies died in the Red Sea in an earlier story of the Bible. So she must have been very puzzled at first when her father, instead of showing joy toward her, instead tears his clothes and grieves, instead telling her that given his vow to Yahweh, he must offer her up as a burnt offering. In response, she doesn't fight it, but rather asks for a time to grieve over her virginity. That she will never have known a man and have a child is the one thing she cites as something she needs to do before her father sacrifices her. He lets her go, and for 2 months Jephthah's daughter weeps over her virginity, and the text makes the point that she never had relationships with a man. It also makes the point that when she returned, that Jephthah did to her as he said he would do according to his vow. So he offered his only child and daughter to Yahweh as a burnt offering in order to keep his oath. The text then notes that this is why for 4 days during the year the daughters of Israel commemorate Jephthah's daughter. Now, there are some parts of this story that are assumed and not written down, and the first thing we need to remember is that the law of Yahweh is part of the backdrop to the story, particularly God's commands about oaths. Numbers 32 is pretty clear. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to put himself under a binding obligation, he shall not break his word. He shall act in accordance with everything that comes out of his mouth. Later on, David will write about something like this in Psalm 15:4. He has a phrase that states, he takes an oath to his own detriment and does not change. In other words, what we're getting here is the backdrop of a culture that takes oaths very seriously to the point that they believe God has given them the order to do these oaths, and even if that oath is to the detriment of the person, it needs to be kept because it was given to God. An often used example is King Saul as someone who failed to keep their oaths and had dire consequences befall them. King Saul's story is after the time of Jephthah in this, but it does make the point that the oaths of the person should be kept, because if you don't, Yahweh will cause dire consequences to come upon you for not keeping your oaths, and not doing so much is very in the face of Yahweh. When you consider keeping your oaths to Yahweh as part of the commands of the law. Jephthah feels honor-bound to keep his oath to God and has his own fears that he will lose everything he has gained through oaths given to him by his family. They have kept their vows to him and made him head of the family, and he has brought them victory. Oaths fulfilled. Jephthah is trapped now by his own society, honor at this point, as well as the commands of God. I want people to understand that Jephthah is in a very real way being forced at this point by Yahweh to sacrifice his child in order to keep his oath. Yahweh's commands about oaths are very ultimately clear on this issue. Not Jephthah's decision, although I think it also comes into play as well, but it's a secondary to the demand of Yahweh that oaths are to be fulfilled according to his command in Numbers 32. God is definitely demanding Jephthah keep his oath through the law. Thus my title that God is demanding it, because he is. The other thing in this story, but people don't often consider, is the nature of the burnt offering. Leviticus 1 gives us a law according to burnt offerings. While there is no law concerning human beings being offered up in this sacrifice, there are many things that are the same regardless of whether the sacrifice is a bull, a sheep, or 2 pigeons, okay? Number one, the sacrifice has to be inspected by the priest to make sure there's no fault or blemish. It basically has to be thoroughly inspected for this aspect in order for the sacrifice to be considered legitimate. The number 2 thing that you have to remember is the person offering the sacrifice is the one that has to kill it. The priests don't actually kill any sacrifice. The one offering it up does. Number 3, the blood of this sacrifice is collected by the priest and sprinkled on the altar and around the entrance of the tabernacle. Number 4, the sacrifice is skinned and then cut into pieces by the person who is offering the sacrifice. Number 5, the priest then makes the fire and arranges the pieces on the altar. They wash the entrails and sacrifice of the sacrifice as well as the legs for purification. Number 6, the sacrifice is completely burned up so there is nothing left and is declared to be a sweet-smelling aroma to the Lord, something that soothes him and pleases him. Number 7, I also want to note that the burnt offering were not private affairs. They were done in public before the congregation at the tabernacle. We need to understand at this point that these things are what happened to Jephthah's daughter, which are summarized in Judges 11 with the short phrase, and at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, who did to her what he had vowed, in verse 39 of Judges 11. In other words, Jephthah's daughter, her pubescent body was stripped naked, and she was inspected by the priest for blemish and defect. Once completed, her own father slit her throat, and she bled out while the police collected her blood and sprinkled it on the altar in the entrance of the tabernacle. Jephthah himself would have had to skin her and cut her into pieces. Her entrails and legs are washed, and then the whole of her body would have been put on the altar and burned until there was nothing left but ash. This was all a soothing aroma, a pleasing aroma to God. It was pleasing to him. When I was a believer, the mental and moral gymnastics I had to go through to justify this story were legion. The fact that everything was secondary to the obedience of God, even the lives of one's own family, is pretty evident in the story. But it was more than that you consider the members of your own family as nothing more than sacrifice material if your vow demands is also apparent. Now, there are some interpreters who try to get past this, saying that perhaps Jephthah didn't actually do it, but this is pretty much an interpretation that flies in the face of the plain reading of the text. Jephthah is said to have done it and fulfilled his oath. And why would an Israelite woman then create a custom of remembrance of her death if she didn't actually die? Sorry, the text pretty much say that Jephthah kills his daughter and offered up as a burnt offering sacrifice according to that custom. The real problem I have with the story is that Yahweh does nothing to stop it like he does with Abraham and Isaac. He lets it go forward, and the only action he really does in the story is that he's reportedly the one who gave Jephthah the victory. If he knew in his foreknowledge that what was going to come out and greet Jephthah was his daughter, he simply does nothing to avoid this eventuality. He foresaw it and probably even made it come about. Now we get to Hebrews 11. The writer of Hebrews lists Jephthah as one of the examples his readers should look for as an example of somebody who had a promise from God, and it was later fulfilled. In this case, Jephthah, that God would give him a victory is kind of assumed simply because he believed God would give him a victory, but makes an oath and a vow to kind of guarantee that fact. The writer of Hebrews may also have been using Jephthah, indicated by the importance of obedience to God, even when it costs you something precious or takes a long time for things to be fulfilled. Now that I no longer believe, I find this story reprehensible for a lot of reasons. I was going to include this in my Halloween series last year as a macabre story, because it is. But that series was having fun at some of the biblical stories and events and trying to use them in a humorous way to illustrate the absurdity of the Bible. The problem is I don't find this story in any way funny, nor can I find it in my heart to try to make it so. In fact, it's a tragic tale for everyone but Yahweh. Firstly, under secular morality, bastardy is just not a thing. No child should be held responsible for who their parents are. The fact that Jephthah's mother is a prostitute is irrelevant to me under secular morality, as he is not responsible for who his father and mother and what they were and what their relationship was. The issue of inheritance being strictly, legitimately sons and not daughters is also sexist, which is something I would reject as well. All the children of Gilead should have shared in the inheritance of their father, no one excluded, and if that was the attitude, then none of this antagonism would have existed in the family. We could have changed the entire rest of the story, as Jephthah would have just simply been raised up as a leader of the family because he is the one skilled in battle. The whole idea that we need to fight over a war over territory is dropped in secular morality as well. I see no need for it, as coming to an agreement and perhaps share the land and live in peace is preferable. But once again, we have two gods reinforcing their various people groups is tribalism in the story. There's no need for the slaughter of another tribe if a peaceful arrangement could have been reached, and there's no need for the vow Jephthah makes later in the first place, as a whole bunch of people could have returned back to their homes and families in peace. By getting rid of the rivalry between the two groups, which has its basis in the belief as it's part of a war between two gods, a lot of tragic deaths could have been avoided. And dealing with the elephant in the room. The sacrifice of Jephthah's daughter is a barbaric Iron Age nonsense. Why would a God who has all the omni things have need for a sacrifice in the first place? Has always been a common criticism of Yahweh in the first place. The notion of oaths is completely stupid and not really with a God who knows all things. You shouldn't have to prove your dedication to God through sacrifice when he already absolutely knows your heart and dedication to him. You either must accept God isn't all-knowing in his story, and thus he needs a sacrificial system for people to prove their loyalty to him, or that he knows and still makes you do barbaric things to prove your loyalty. As someone deconverted from all this, I can call this story what it is, a barbaric Iron Age nonsense, and a good example of how religious belief can, in a divine command theory context, can lead a person to suppress their natural good moral sense and do something I would consider evil. Most people think killing their child is an evil and immoral act, but all of a sudden, because it's a dedicated move to fulfilling an oath for Yahweh, suddenly becomes a good thing. But in this case, belief in divine command gets a man to be considered a hero of faith, even though he literally slits his daughter's own throat, lets her bleed out right in front of him, skins her and cuts her into pieces and lets her body be burned until there's nothing left. And then hundreds of years later, people will say this guy was a hero of faith because he did this. He kept his word to God, and that was the important thing, right? Know that this also demonstrates that second morality and your own moral sense given by the simple fact you are part of a social species that needs morality to survive and thrive, give you a better and less barbaric sense of what is right and wrong in this world than divine command theory ever will. You're better off not being subject to this Iron Age's war god's morality and looking at things rationally, with basic human empathy and a sense of equality for all. At this point, I'm kind of going off script. I want to go back to my statement about how I was going to include this in my Halloween special as another way of illustrating the absurdity of some of the scriptural texts, given, how macabre they are, or weird, or spooky back then. But I decided not to include this one because there was no way to really make fun of it. It's not a funny story. It's a tragic story. Jephthah's daughter is kind of memorialized, but We don't even know what her name is. Okay, she's never named in the story, and it's just a really weird thing that happens in the story is that she is not named. But it goes deeper than that. Often on this channel, whenever I talk about morality, I always get the question, well, isn't secular morality just based on your opinion? And like, no. It's a common anti-atheist trope that theists often employ, saying that, if we don't have a God, we don't have morality. And that's just a statement made by people steeped in divine command theory. But here we have a case where divine command theory actually leads to somebody's detriment, in particular Jephthah's daughter. Jephthah, I am not going to let off the hook either, because if he was following his own good moral sense, he would have defied Yahweh and said, no, I'm not killing my daughter. This is my one and only child. Anybody else in this context, if it was a different context other than divine command theory and obedience, would say that this is a very immoral act. And it just shows that we have a better moral sense now than people of the past did who believe this sort of thing. It's kind of interesting to me that people continue to make this accusation of we have better morality because we follow the divine commands of God. Well, here's an example of a story where somebody followed the commands of God. It was detrimental to him, and it was detrimental to his daughter, certainly detrimental to her. And it ended up being a very tragic tale. And everybody wants to put the blame on Jephthah, but we seem to forget that God is the one who made the command about oaths in the first place. So this is a divine command that Jephthah is following. He's simply following orders. And that's another mentality that really gets into my craw these days, because I just followed orders has been one of the excuses that most people who implemented some of the great tragedies of the earth just simply say to you in their defense. It just isn't a good defense. Okay, you have your own innate moral senses given to you by being a part of a social species. You have your own human empathy. You have your own reason. You have your own society that you live in and what their values are and what you've been raised to have. There's more to morality and secular morality than just my opinion, man. And I'm sorry, that's an accusation that's been given to me a lot of times. And I just want to clear that up as we deal with this story, that that's not the case. When I look at Jephthah's actions, he as a basic human being should realize that this was a wrong thing to do. And, we can't let Yahweh off the hook, because Yahweh either knew or caused Jephthah's daughter to come out of the house when she did and do what she did, so that she ends up being sacrificed. It's amazing how we want to get, how theists want to get rid of God's control or knowledge of the situation on this particular issue, that all of a sudden, we're just going to dismiss that. Well, it's Jephthah's fault. Well, isn't God in control of all things? Isn't God know everything? He knew what was going to happen. And why does God not have a clause about human beings if human beings are the ones that are going to be sacrificed? I don't want human beings to be sacrificed, so let's have a substitute for that. He doesn't have that, and he doesn't have it in this story either. I find it very interesting that in an earlier story, Abraham is ordered by God to let Isaac loose, and then, and provides another sacrifice for that very purpose. But in the case of Jephthah's daughter, no such accommodation is made by God. All of a sudden, God says, nope, I want this woman, this young pubescent girl probably, to die in a horrible manner in order to please me and know that Jephthah will keep his vows. It's like, really, dude? That's your requirement? You know what's on everybody's heart, but you don't know that Jephthah's loyal to? It's almost like the God of the Bible isn't presented as an all-knowing being, because he isn't. Okay, there are several times he says, I don't know. And that's abhorrent, but if those verses don't mean anything, then they just might as well not be in the Bible. For me, on a personal note, this is a very abhorrent story because I have a daughter. And I'm telling you right now, somebody telling me that God told me to kill my daughter in this manner, I would immediately go ballistic on them. And I'm sorry, I have better moral senses than Jephthah, because I'm not letting Jephthah completely off the hook, because he should have defied his God. There have been several character of Scripture that argue with God, like Moses himself. And those tales may have been going around at Jephthah's time. Who knows? Because everything's being thrown together in 60 BC anyway, or 600 BC, excuse me. And so we don't really know what this real story is or where it came from. But the point is that Jephthah makes his rash vow, and instead of going before God and saying, like many other characters of Scripture have done, and said, is there a way I can redeem my daughter? But there is no provision for redemption of women or daughters in this case. There's plenty of stuff for firstborn sons, but not for daughters. This passage just emotionally disturbs me because I do have a daughter. And the thought of having to put a blade to her throat, to slit her throat, watch other people, poke and prod her, to inspect her, to make sure that she's a proper sacrifice, like she's some animal, to and I don't want to get into all the other implications of that. And then watch her blood being scattered all over the altar and all over the entrance to me, and then having to skin her and cut her up in pieces for the sacrifice myself. That ain't happening. Okay, and that just shows that what divine command theory does to your brain. This indoctrination that God is good has you look at one of the most horrible stories in all of Scripture and try to justify it because you have to. And I'm so glad I'm just not a part of that emotionally anymore. I can see Yahweh for what he is. He's a hill god who is an Iron Age war god that the children of Israel prayed to, and he had wars with other gods, including in this story. There's definitely an aspect of where Jephthah brings it up, that it's your god, Chemesh, or whatever it is, and that's the basis for the conflict. It's tribalistic, it's nonsense, and the fact that Jephthah will go along with this shows that his religion has caused him to diminish his humanity. He doesn't have any human or moral, his human moral sense, his love for his daughter, all goes out the window because he has to fulfill his oaths because God said so. And he does something detrimental to himself, something detrimental to his family, all because he made an oath, and because the commandments of oath is very clear. This is not Jephthah's ultimate responsibility, but he does share in it, and his daughter pays the price. And I'm sorry, I'm very emotional about this story because of I have my own child, a daughter. Now I have 2 sons as well, but the thought of taking my one and only daughter and having to do this is just repugnant to me. And any God who would demand this of his people is morally evil. And so for a long time, in stories like this and others that have just made me say, sorry, Yahweh is just a morally evil God. He's a detestable character. So there's that aspect of it. When it comes to being a hero of faith, like the writer of Hebrews says, I would have to say perhaps the writer of Hebrews he's looking for examples of people who in faith did something before they were tested in that faith. And in this case, Jephthah makes an oath before he fights the battle, and I think that's the focus that the writer of Hebrews wants to do. But he also may very well and he kept that oath even to his own detriment. And so you need to keep your oaths to God in following Jesus until Jesus returns. Even though we're past this, time period of the first generation, and they're watching Jews leave the church. You need to still stick with your oath. You need to still stick with your thing. And the fact that the writer of Hebrews will use such a reprehensible story to me to do this speaks volumes of how even the writer of Hebrews has his moral senses dulled. Okay, and this is what religion does. It dulls your moral senses. From a deconversion standpoint, I'm glad that there are stories in the Bible like this because it makes it very easy to dismiss God as the Iron Age deity that he was, that Yahweh was not a good guy. I can look at stories like this and realize how very human and how very flawed they are, and how flawed the morality of this God is. And that's why I can dismiss him. He's right up there with all the other deities of polytheistic pantheons that is morally reprehensible by modern moral understandings, which have developed and grown and become better over time. And so, I don't know, I guess you're going to have to deal with it. I'm sure I'm going to get all these comments from theists about, yes, he has to be obedient and all that, but that just proves to me the point I'm trying to make, that your own innate moral senses, given by the fact that you're part of a social species, which includes your moral empathy, your reason, and a whole bunch of other factors that should factor in it, your religion has caused you to diminish all that, the good thing that is, and actually justify an evil action, a sacrifice of a man's daughter, because Yahweh demands it. That's where you put yourself. From a deconversion point of view, I'm glad I can now dismiss these stories as what they are, mythology and fiction. And I really hope they are, but this is one of those stories where it could have been based on something real, because there's nothing really quote-unquote miraculous in it other than Jephthah is successful after his vow, and Yahweh is given the credit for that. But that's post hoc rationalization in the story, even inside the story. So there's really no action of God. There definitely was a sacrificial system. There's definitely a man, maybe named Jephthah, who had a daughter. All of this has a realistic feel to it, like it's based on something that actually happened. And that's what bothers me the most, is it could be a true story. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I hope it's not. My own innate fatherly sense over my daughter kind of hopes that it's not. But I'm always interested in what you have to say, so go away in the comments and, give your opinion. I'm sure there's going to be many people that come to Yahweh's defense, even though in this particular case, he's pretty much a morally reprehensible character that could have let Jephthah off his vow and let him have a substitute, but he doesn't do that. So, like he did in the past. So that's that. And so, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate every like, share, and subscribe. You guys supporting the channel just by liking the video is always well appreciated. There's also super chat, super thanks, as well as my PayPal link in the description if you want to continue to support my work to normalize atheism and deconversion. But the best way you can do that is become a member. Becoming a citizen of the Rabyd Nation allows me to focus more and more on doing videos that you love and enjoy instead of focusing on appeasing the YouTube algorithm, although I think this one probably will appease that algorithm in a certain sense. But thanks once again and for stopping by, and any support you give is greatly appreciated. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So you want to take all your time, money, and opportunities and give them to yourself, the people you love and care for, and make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do so. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.